it's very unlikely that I am actually hearing the voice of God, and everything he has to say just perfectly aligns with me and my opinions and my preferences and proclivities and on, which is why God speaks through difference. If we expect God's words to always be comfort, then we are only listening for one side of his voice. Because the reality is, just read the Bible. Yes, God's voice is comforting, but just as often, maybe more often, God's voice is confrontation, which is why he speaks to us through difference, through unlikely means. And he says things sometimes that are really uncomfortable.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture Podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy, it only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit 5 stars. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you're new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included Steve Carter, AJ Swoboda, and Scott McKnight. You can go back, listen to those episodes, and more. But today's guest is Jay Kim. J.Y. Kim is lead pastor of WestGate Church, a multisite church in Silicon Valley. He is the author of Analog Church, Why We Need Real People, Places, and Things in the Digital Age, winner of the Gospel Coalition's First-Time Author Award, and follow-up, Analog Christian, Cultivating Contentment, Resilience, and Wisdom in the Digital Age. He co-hosts the ReGeneration Podcast, and this fall, he will co-host Barna's new podcast, Making Space. The world is noisy. It's hard to listen, to pay attention, and attune to God. Jay Kim helps us do just that in this conversation. Jay shares his journey of learning to tune out distractions and align his life to God's frequency through daily habits of prayer, scripture reading, and creating space for listening. We talk about hearing God speak through diverse communities, listening and speaking across differences, and cultivating empathy through curiosity and conversations. Jay offers practical tips for incorporating rhythms that promote detachment from technology and create space to listen to God and others deeply. So join us as we learn to listen well in a noisy world. Here's my conversation with Jay Kim. Jay, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really excited to have you on. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, glad to be on.
Yeah, I'd love to hear your relationship between noise and silence, being able to hear in a noisy world. What has your relationship been with sound?
Yeah, I think my relationship with sound and noise has been what it is for probably most people listening, living in the modern world, living in the digital age. It's been chaos, and that's really why I wrote, this book, Listen, Listen, Speak. I found myself sort of, especially in recent years, I found myself immensely frustrated with my own inability to hear well the voice of God. I knew intellectually, cognitively that, theologically, God is speaking. God has something to say, but I felt like there was too much noise all around me. And whether that's, social media or news media or just the voices in my own head, yeah, it's been frustrating, but I believed that there was a path forward. And so that's been the last several years, and the reason it's a book is because my hunch is that a lot of people feel the way I feel which is it's a noisy world. I want to hear God, but I don't know how. It feels like he's silent, even though, again, theologically, I know that he's not. So, yeah, that's kind of where the book came from, and that's been my relationship to noise.
Yeah. Well, that is a question many people are asking is, how do I hear God? Is he speaking? What is going on here? Have you found a way in your own life to be able to turn down the noise so that you could hear?
Yeah, I mean, that's much of what the book is about is, there's no way for us to control. We have no control over noise pollution on a literal level, as urbanization has moved more and more people away from the quiet sprawls of rural America and rural lands across the world, and more into noisy cities and urban contexts, as well as just suburban sprawls where there's lots of people sort of side by side. There's no way to control that necessarily, but, I'm wearing these AirPods as we're having this podcast conversation. And these are the same AirPods I wear when I go to the gym to, go for a jog on the treadmill or whatever. And the gym's kind of a noisy place. And the reason I've got these AirPods is because they've got this noise cancellation feature. And so I'll listen to music or maybe a podcast while I'm working out, and I'll, trigger the noise cancellation. And what that's not doing is canceling out or suppressing the noise that's actually all around me. It's focusing, it's attuning my listening to the thing that's kind of right here, immediate. And so I think that's the invitation. We don't control how much noise there is in the world and in our lives, but there is a way in which we can attune ourselves, our hearts and our minds and our bodies to hear with clarity, the voice of God that is speaking.
So then what's been a helpful practice to you to be able to attune your ears towards God? What has really helped you?
Yeah, lots of things. I think the first one that comes to mind is I realized a number of years ago that I had sort of grown in my frustration to hear God because I was only listening for God when I thought I needed to hear from him. The philosopher Dallas Willard has this great line in his book, Hearing God, where he says that our failure to hear God, or our failure to hear his voice when we want to, is due to the fact that we do not in general want to hear it, that we want it only when we think we need it, which is so interesting. When I first read that in the book, in his book, it struck me like, oh my goodness, that's it. That is the diagnosis for my own frustration. I don't know how many of our listeners are old enough to remember. I remember when I was a kid, there was these things called radios. And this was long before the era of podcasts and YouTube and all of that. But radios, like the old school radios, especially, they would have these little dials, and you would sort of roll the dial back and forth to find the right frequency to hear with clarity the particular radio station you were looking for. But while you were sort of scrolling the dial, the little knob would move between frequencies, and it was mostly static. It was mostly chaos. But then as it got closer and closer to the frequency you were looking for, like AM 680 or whatever, you would begin to lose the static, and more you would hear like an audible voice or sound or whatever until you got to real clarity. And then you would kind of lock in right there. And that's what I've learned to sort of, for me, the unlocking sort of hearing God's voice clearly in my life is that. It's not that he's not speaking. It's that I am tapping into all sorts of other frequencies. And it's mostly static. It's just mostly chaotic cacophony, just like a bunch of, like on and on, like social media noise, news media, all of that, the voices in my own head. And so really it becomes a struggle when I'm looking for the clarity of God's voice sporadically every now and then. What I need to do is attune the center of my life to the frequency of God's voice and kind of leave it locked in there. The more I can do that, what I've come to realize is that the more consistently I hear his voice with clarity, because my life is aligned to the frequency of his voice. Not just searching for it when I think I need it, but living what I would call, what many call a listening life, locked into the frequency of the voice of God that is always speaking.
I think that's a beautiful thing, to be able to be attuned to God all the time, to have a listening life and to walk into it. I think a lot of people listening, and for me, it's like I desire to be that way. I desire that. What are some first, second steps that people could take to start to find that frequency and live into that listening life on a daily basis?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, there's so many things, several things, but the first that comes to mind is just practice. We have to reorient and rehabituate our lives to becoming a listener, for the voice of God. So one of the things I would say is, again, coming back to the idea that often we struggle to hear the voice of God because we're listening for it only when we think we need it. I think one of the practices that's been so helpful for me is to habituate myself in the morning and in the evening and throughout the day with particular practices to be, again, aligned and locked into the frequency of God's voice. So I'll share a few things that have been helpful for me. This is descriptive, not prescriptive. I think people have to find what works for them. But, every morning before the kids, I've got 2 young kids. So before the kids wake up, as I'm making and drinking my coffee every morning as a matter of habit and practice, I spend time reading the Psalms. So I'm listening for God's voice, reading the Psalms. I do this before I open my phone, before I open, a news app or social media or check my email or text messages. Before any of that, I did it this morning. I pour my coffee and sit in the Psalms. I was in Psalm 108, this morning. And so I do that. And then I drop off the kids at school every day, and we go through the New City Catechism with them as a matter of habit. And so I ask them some of the catechism questions, the simple and basic ones. And I do this as a sort of prayerful exercise. And the moment they're out of the car, I pray the Lord's Prayer specifically for them. Lord, today, may your kingdom come and will be done in Harper's life. And may your kingdom come and will be done in Simon's life. And then I let that lead me into more specific prayers. Today, pray for my wife. Today, God, give Jenny her daily bread, what she needs. And I'll pray for specific needs. So I do that, again, to align myself to be in conversation with God and to hear from him. Throughout the day, I practice breath prayers. I've got these short little breath prayers I'll pray. At the end of every day in the evening, as a family, we practice the examen together, the prayer of examen. It's a simple way to reflect on your day with God. We do that as a family. So those are some examples. And I do these things as a matter of practice. Like, I'm committed to them every single day. And again, it's a way of aligning myself to hearing the voice of God consistently, not just when I think I need it, but at all times.
It's really helpful to see what a picture looks like for you to align and attune to the voice of God. So now that you are there, you have the frequency, you know what the frequency is. Now we're in conversation together today in the middle of the day, and you have done some of these practices. You've aligned and attuned to the frequency of God. How do you hear God's voice in this conversation? So as we're speaking, you're listening to me ask you questions, you're responding, we're having a conversation. What does it look like to hear God in the midst of a conversation we're having together?
That's a great question. I think often we think of prayer as words we say to God, and that certainly can be a part of prayer. But I think just as much so, prayer is listening for God. So that's one thing I'm doing, even as we're talking. Just an openness of spirit, open heart, open mind. Lord, if you need to interrupt my thoughts here, then please interrupt. Give me the words to say. And then I think prayer is really also, in large part, about an awareness that God is present in this place, that God is present with you and with me, and collectively with us as brothers. And really, I think living and engaging in any conversation, any interaction with an openness to the Spirit of God who is in us and with us is a way in which, again, I live attuned to the voice of God, open to his interruptions and sort of obediently leaning into whatever direction he might be asking us to lean into in any conversation.
Do you have a story, an example of God interrupting your thoughts or your path for the day and you walking in the direction that God has said, go this way or do this thing?
Yeah, I've got lots of examples. I do, but I've also got lots of examples of sensing those promptings and then being too scared to do anything about them, which is embarrassing. But I say that because I think probably lots of us listening have those examples. And one, I share my story because I just want to alleviate any sense of guilt or shame. I think that it's a process, and God is our Father. He gets it, and it doesn't change his love for us, his nearness to us, his desire, and his longing for deep, meaningful relationship with us. But I've got tons of examples where it's like, oh, I had this prompting, and I shared one at our church actually recently about being at a Target and running into someone that I had actually been thinking about, someone who doesn't know Jesus, and having this really strong prompting, like, hey, go to them. They didn't see me, but I saw them. And I had this strong prompting, go to them, say hello, and invite them to, we had Christmas coming out, and invite them to join you at Christmas services. And I just didn't, and I just didn't. It was like so embarrassing. But I've also had moments like that quite a bit where I, muster the courage to do the thing. So I just had a situation like that this past Sunday at church. Somebody came up after the service for prayer, and we were talking, and I just had a sense that maybe they needed a particular type of comfort, and I wasn't sure if that was true, but I just said, hey, I don't know if this means anything to you, but my sense is that maybe what you need to hear today from God is this particular thing. It wasn't anything very specific, but just a general sort of sense prompting, and it was really meaningful to them. So yeah, those moments happen from time to time. And I think if we can muster the courage to say yes to what we sense might be God's invitation, sometimes it's nothing, but often there are these really beautiful stories that unfold, as a gift from God to us for our faithfulness. So yeah, there you go.
Before you were talking about what you do during the day, and a lot of it of being attuned to God and listening to God happens within your family. So it happens communally.
Yeah.
What's the role of community in hearing and listening for God?
That's a wonderful question. For me, in my own life, one of the ways that God has spoken most profoundly to me over the years is through his people. Now, what I'm not saying is that, we should take everything everyone says to us about God or about our lives as like canon. It's not that necessarily, but I really do believe that God speaks often quite clearly through the community of people that he's called us to belong to. And we see this in scripture over and over again, time and time again. And, when you think about the Acts story, when literally the Christian church is birthed in this incredible movement of people who don't even speak the same language. I mean, there's from a variety of cultures and backgrounds. And it's a reversal of the Babel story early on in Genesis, 11, where, the culmination of Genesis chapters 3 to 11, essentially the sort of breaking down of God's vision for human flourishing, where just people go their own way and do their own thing. It culminates in the Babel story, where out of human pride and sin, these people are trying to build a tower that reaches the heavens and to be gods themselves, essentially to make a name for themselves. And God scatters them, and he gives them different languages. And then in Genesis, and then in the book of Acts, when the early church is birthed at Pentecost, and the Spirit of God, falls upon his people. And all of these people from diverse backgrounds with different languages, they hear the good news of Jesus, the resurrected Christ, in their own language. And because of this, they are unified and brought together. And then the story goes on, like they don't leave, they like live together and share everything in common and become this incredible community of Jesus people. It's bound up together in a way that's just so unique. And that I think that that's still true today. The local community of God's people are this like unlikely motley crew. The theologian Scott McKnight calls them, it's the title of one of his books, he calls them difference, like not difference as in like ENCE, but difference as in like different plural. All these different types of people all bound up together, a fellowship of difference. And that's how it's God speaking. It's like these people that you would otherwise have no connection to. You've now been bound up together as brothers and sisters, as family. And as unlikely as it is, God tends to speak to us and through us in these communities of difference.
Yes, he does a lot. How do we listen across differences then? A lot of times we do like to stay in our own silos, and we're more comfortable when we're not in this community of difference. But God has brought us into this place where we have a common purpose, right? And we have a common Jesus, so that we could come around that. How do we listen and or speak across differences?
I mean, I think before we ask the question how, I think it's important for us to think about why. And if you really just think about it logically, one of the critically important whys behind why God speaks to us through difference, through unlikely means, is because in our sort of silos and echo chambers, which are so common in the digital age and in the era of social media, if God always sounds the way we expect him to sound, if God's opinions are always perfectly aligned with our opinions, if God's preferences are always perfectly aligned with our preferences, it means one of two things. It means very likely that either we are God, or it means that it's not God. And the first is just theologically wrong. Like, I'm not God. So the second must be true, that it's very unlikely that I am actually hearing the voice of God, and everything he has to say just perfectly aligns with me and my opinions and my preferences and proclivities and on, which is why God speaks through difference. If we expect God's words to always be comfort, then we are only listening for one side of his voice. Because the reality is, just read the Bible. Yes, God's voice is comforting, but just as often, maybe more often, God's voice is confrontation, which is why he speaks to us through difference, through unlikely means. And he says things sometimes that are really uncomfortable. So, how do we listen? I think we listen humbly. If it is true that sometimes God needs to confront us, then we need humility. Confrontation will never, healthy, Christ-centered, godly confrontation will never have its full effect unless we approach it and receive it with a sense of humility. And then on the other side, when we are speaking, same thing. We need to speak with humility. We need to speak as good news people. And we need to speak, I think, especially in the digital age, we need to speak in what I would call, we need to speak in place in a placeless age. There is this incredible temptation to just grab our phones and scream into the digital ether. But I think the places where our voices will be most heard and have the most resonance are in our local communities and in our local contexts, with it situated within meaningful relationships where we can do life with one another, not just shout and scream, but actually share life with each other.
I think when we are in proximity with one another, we're going to see a totally different aspect. We'll speak different, right? Because on social media, you don't actually see anybody. You don't know who's receiving your words, your information. You can yell and scream and be belligerent because there isn't consequence on the back end of it. But if I'm here, I mean, I'm sure a few people would yell at you, but not very many would yell and scream at Jay when we're in the same room or speaking one to another, because I realize that you are a beloved child of God. You're made in his image. There is shared humanity between us. What's the role of proximity, was what you said, in our conversations as we speak and listen?
Yeah, I mean, you said it. I think proximity matters so much, and it's really underrated. I think today, especially because of digital technology, not only is proximity underrated, I think it's just sort of neglected, which is, we're seeing the fallout of that just in the way we are screaming and shouting and sort of spewing vitriol at each other online. There was a late 20th century social commentator named Neil Postman, wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. Not Christian, he was a social commentator, but he talks about how he's got this wonderful quote. He says that in the modern world, the tie between information and action has been severed, and information is now a form of entertainment. And then he says we are glutted with information. We're drowning in information, but we don't know what to do with information. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of. In local contexts, you can take whatever information and it forces you to do something with it, because I am doing life with these people. Like it's not just about me tweeting a 240 character sort of hot take. It's about me actually caring for the person in my midst, in my neighborhood or in my school or my church or workplace or whatever. And I think we need to get back to that. We've sort of, because everybody's screaming at each other digitally, we've bought the lie that that's what we're supposed to do, that's the most meaningful use of our time and our energy. And it's not. And we're doing that at the neglect of real people in our real lives, in the real places where we live, where we can make a real difference, not just with our words, but with our actions. And I think, it's a challenge, but followers of Jesus especially, we are called to embody the way of Jesus in real ways. And we need to get back to that.
I think this is one of the reasons why I really like Luke 10, when Jesus sends out his 72. He says, when you do find those people of peace that you could stay with, then sit and eat what is set before you. And that's the first thing that he tells them to do is to share a meal with somebody, so that when I share a meal with somebody, I have a conversation. I get to know who they are. I ask questions about their story. They ask questions about my story. We're sharing stories. We're sharing a meal. And then he says to heal the sick, which is to encounter Jesus in a way that is a felt need. And then at the end, proclaim after that, all those things have happened, that the kingdom of God has come near. And oftentimes I think that we want to shout and proclaim first.
Yeah.
And so I think the role of sitting down, we can't actually be good news people if we don't know what is good news to the people that we're with. How can we start to discover what is good news for Jay today? How can I ask those questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think it comes back to listening. The reason the title of the book is Listen, Listen, Speak. Some people have asked me, it's like, oh yeah, I get it. 2 ears, one mouth. And that's certainly true. But actually it's called Listen, Listen, Speak because a number of years ago, I just found myself hearing people talk, but not really listening. What I mean by that is I'd be in conversations, even meaningful ones, with people that I love. This is sad to admit and kind of embarrassing, but I found myself over and over again distracted with my own thoughts. And what I mean is I was simply listening as a framework for crafting whatever I wanted to say. So rather than listening for listening's sake, rather than listening in order to receive and to hold and cherish this person's story, I was listening so that whatever they say becomes the backdrop for whatever it is I really felt like I wanted to say. So speaking was the key. Listening was just kind of background noise. And it was having significant detrimental impact on my relationships, just on me, and who I was becoming. And so I remember reading years ago a book by a writer named Parker Palmer, a book called Hidden Wholeness. And he talks about how the human soul is like a wild animal. And what he says is, if you want to see a wild animal like out in the wilderness, nobody goes to see a wild animal by like going crashing through the woods, making a bunch of noise like, hey, come on out. If you want to see a wild animal, he says you have to walk quietly into the woods and sit very patiently at the base of a tree, sort of like immerse yourself in the surroundings, breathe deeply and quietly, and then maybe the wild animal will make an appearance, and you cherish that. And Parker Palmer says that's the human soul. And for me, that was such helpful imagery, because if I ever have anything to say that's going to be meaningful to someone, I can't go crashing into the relationship with all the things I want to say. What I've got to do is sit quietly at the base of the tree and create the space and the safety to listen well. To listen not for the sake of responding and speaking, but to listen for the sake of listening. And then maybe I'll have something to say. That's why the book is called Listen, Speak. And I've discovered that the human soul is a wild animal. And the real you is most comfortable and feels most safe to actually make an appearance if I, instead of just crashing in with my own words, can sit quietly and create the safe space for you to reveal yourself. And it's in those moments that maybe now I can speak to you, like into the real you, rather than just screaming and shouting at each other. So that's sort of the first thought that comes to mind when it comes to speaking effectively to one another.
I like that a lot. I think that even if we are sitting at the base of the tree and we're silent, a lot of times we can hear, but we don't listen. Yeah. What is the difference then between hearing and truly listening? And is there a practice to help us get better at truly listening in a conversation so I could know your words and take them in and not just hear the words that are coming at me?
Yeah, I think one of the first things we have to do is question the things. This seems counterintuitive, but in order for us to hear well and to speak well, we have to begin asking ourselves why I want to say what I want to say. Again, I think in a noisy world, we are so accustomed to, we feel like if we're not saying something, we're like, our life is meaningless, or we're not contributing, or whatever else. And so I think there's several questions we have to ask ourselves, like, why do I want to say what I want to say? Like, really? And then as we're listening and formulating a response, okay, let me listen some more. What am I missing here that probably requires more attention? My friend Steve Carter says it this way, like, what is the thing beneath the thing? There's almost always a thing beneath a thing. And then, to ask ourselves the question, I'm going to say what I'm going to say, but is there a way that I can say this that will draw others in rather than push people away, or build bridges rather than walls? So those are some practical questions that have been really helpful for me in speaking well into the lives of others.
Is there a way that you've learned then to draw people in from the way, Jesus says to his disciples that nobody can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws them? Like, he's drawing people to himself. Can we take an example from God of how he draws people, and that we can start to emulate and be like him?
Yeah. That text, I think there's a lot more to it. I think there's like theological treatment of it, the Spirit of God is the only one that can actually have salvific impact on a human life. But I do think in Jesus, we see an incredible example of drawing others in. One of the most fascinating things about Jesus to me is that he was absolutely unapologetic in speaking the truth, and yet like the worst of sinners in his day wanted nothing more than to spend time with him. They invited him to their parties, and it's so interesting. So there must be a way in which you can speak truth with such winsomeness and love and compassion and empathy that even those who disagree want to be around you and you have their listening ear. And so, yes, generally speaking, I think just immersing ourselves in the Gospels, studying the example of Jesus, how he spoke to particular people, his posture toward them, not just his spoken words, but what his posture toward them said. I think there's a lot to be learned there about having a posture of generosity and compassion and empathy that speaks, I think, in many ways louder than our words.
Mm. Yeah, you see that a lot with Jesus. The rich young ruler comes to him, Jesus looks on him and loves him, but he misses the look and he goes away because he wants his money. The crowds move him to compassion. The Mary and Martha and the people around with Lazarus move him and grieves him in such a way where he weeps with them. He sees people. And I think that's the thing, is we're in this conversation, as we're walking with people, as we're wanting to listen in conversation, we need to truly see people and not just be on the surface. Have you found a way that you have started to see people in conversation, to know what Steve Carter says, what's underneath the thing, what is underneath it?
I just try to hold a posture of curiosity. I love that C.S. Lewis quote that you have never met a mere mortal, that every person is imbued and embedded with a particular dignity and value and worth because they are made in the unique image of God. And so that's been the most helpful thing for me, is to go into every conversation, every situation with curiosity. And sometimes it is, I wonder what the thing beneath this thing is. That idea has been so helpful for me, particularly when it comes to tense conversations. If somebody is, for whatever reason, upset at me or has some sort of tension with me, instead of getting defensive, and sometimes I do get defensive. I am not claiming to do this perfectly or even well all the time, but I try my best to lean into it with curiosity. Yeah, they're upset at me maybe about X, Y, and Z reason, but I try to have a generous assumption about them and to be curious. There's got to be more beneath. There's I wonder what happened in their past that's sort of initiating and triggering these emotions. And so even in healthy relationships and fun conversations, I try to be curious. So it's a simple answer, but it is sort of the key, I think, to unlocking, a listening life, not just to God's voice, but to others, is to be curious about them.
How can I know Andy Crouch talks about parenting your devices or you're in this digital age. And I think in a place when we are starting to be able to listen well and to actually eliminate some of our distractions, how can we start to eliminate digital distractions to be able to listen well?
Yeah, I think you said it. Andy Crouch's work has been immensely helpful to me. So parenting our devices, making sure that we are using our technology and our technology is not using us. Living with an awareness that if we are not intentional with our devices certainly have an intentionality toward us. So all of those things, and there is no easy, simple solution. I just think it's about incorporating particular practices and rhythms and a sort of digital rule of life, and Andy, his suggestions about, digital Sabbaths, an hour a day a week a year. That's a great starting point, to make sure that you are not completely tethered to your technology. So lots of great resources out there. The Common Rule, the TechWise family, I've written a bit about it as well. So whatever works and is most helpful to you, but it should feel like a disruption. It's going to have real impact. It should feel like a loss of sorts, to untether yourself. So, I think that's the way forward, is to incorporate particular practices and rhythms of detaching yourself from technology.
I just want to know, for you in your life, where do you feel like you can listen best? Is there a place? Is there something what some people call would be a thin place where I could experience the presence of God deeper than I do in other places? Is there a place for you that you've really experienced the presence of God?
Yeah, totally descriptive, not prescriptive at all. But for me, it would be every morning in the quiet of my home before the kids wake up, pouring my coffee, reading the Psalms, and talking with God. My family just took a trip to Joshua Tree National Park. That's something that we try to do a couple times a year, is to take the kids to a national park. So those are moments, spaces where I feel really small, but really seen and known at the same time. Those are thin places for me. So those are a couple, one daily and one sort of much bigger, has to be pre-planned, but really impactful. Those are a couple of examples that come to mind.
So good. So if your readers go out, get your book, Listen, Speak, which is a fantastic book, by the way. Good job.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thanks.
What is your hope for your readers? What would you like them to get from this?
Yeah. A sense of possibility that a listening life is possible, a path forward to drowning out all of the noise and attuning your life to the voice of God that often speaks in a gentle whisper, and then a sense of encouragement and confidence that there is a way to speak that can be heard, even in the chaotic, cacophonous, noisy world that we live in today.
Yeah, that's really good. I just have a couple questions I like to ask at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh gosh, the things you think matter so much now matter very little, and the things you are not thinking about right now will become immensely meaningful in your later years.
Man, wouldn't it be great if we could go back and hear that from ourselves? It would be really nice. But that's all right. We grew up, and we're finding it. We're becoming. We're on this road of becoming. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Oh gosh, I'm reading a book right now called Stolen Focus, which is phenomenal. Kind of right in line with this, about our attention and how we have become so distracted today. Yeah, and then I just finished a book by a dear friend named AJ Swoboda. His new book, The Gift of Thorns. It's about desires and longings and what Jesus might have to say about that. And then when I'm watching, I just started that new show, The Three Body Problem, and I don't totally get it yet, but it's fascinating so far. I'm only like 2-3 episodes in, but I'm enjoying it. So
yeah, I've heard that's fascinating. Haven't seen it yet. AJ Swoboda's book is amazing. That's
incredible.
Well done.
Yeah.
So I loved it. Had a really good conversation with him. So
cool.
Go back and listen to that as well. But Jay, this was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for being open and generous, being able to sit here, to be able to listen and speak, have this conversation, know that we can be attuned to God in all of life, that we could live a listening life, that we can speak after we listen and listen well, not just for the great words that I'm going to say as a backdrop to what I need to say, but actually hear people's stories for the sake of their stories. And then being able to hear God in a noisy world, because he's speaking. He's always there. He's always speaking, and we could hear his voice. So thank you for this. It was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.